I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like. Peace. What's up, world? Welcome to this edition of I Mix What I Like right here, BPM. I'm Jared Ball. Very happy to be your host. So I was invited to University of North Carolina, Greensboro, a week or so ago to give a talk and have a discussion about Black studies. Big shout out to Professor Hand, to my man D Noble. It was a great conversation, a great build. I'm looking to bring more of that work and those people to the platform. But the recording didn't work. So what I thought I would do is show some overdue and insufficient appreciation to our patrons and give you all a first look at what I had presented at that talk. And then, as I said, we can build going forward. So again, after some initial greetings and appreciation, again, for Professor Hand, for the Black Studies program, for D Noble, and always being appreciative of being invited to discuss these issues and topics, wanted to again remind everyone that the tradition of Black studies is itself born out of an intellectual wing of the Black liberation struggle. That struggle is still ongoing. It has produced and is producing political prisoners, some of whom are still locked up, including, of course, Mumia, Peltier, Reverend Joy Powell, and others. So free them all, free all political prisoners, free the land. And with that, let's proceed. So as I said, now listen, you will not believe this, and nor should you, because it is not true. And yet what just happened to me has happened and is happening. But once again, my flights down here this morning were crazy. For me, the morning was easy. I got to my gate and seat relatively no problem, and the two seats immediately next to me were empty when pre-selected the night before, and they were still empty when I got on the plane, so I thought, this is about to be even better than I would have imagined. But just as I'm settling in, I overhear one flight attendant telling another that we were in fact going to have two more passengers who had a slight emergency and had been stranded and now needed to jump on our flight. And before I could fully internally complain, disappointed to be losing my rare chance at airline comfort, two frustrated Black faces came piling in. And my displeasure quickly dissipated once I saw that the two already irritated men entering the plane were soon to feel much worse once they realized they'd be sitting next to me. Immediately, I recognized the first and older man, Henry Louis Gates, the self-proclaimed intellectual entrepreneur and literary scholar crowned king of the study of Black people, if not Black studies, and the cause, of course, of the infamous 2009 Beer Summit. Gates doesn't know me and didn't realize how bad his flight was about to be until his colleague, Peniel filed in behind him and saw me grinning ear to ear. Joseph, who once told me he intended to be Gates one day, and who once self-proclaimed to the world himself as the father of Black Power studies, absolutely recognized me and knew his bad time was about to get even worse. I happily made way as Gates moved into the window seat and Joseph was forced to sit in the middle. We both knew he was trapped. I immediately turned and said that I thought this was such a fortuitous moment that I was happy to have happened to be next to the two remaining seats on our flight and that these could now be used to accommodate such legendary scholars. The two men were grumpy and it was very early in the morning. Gates mumbled something about their private plane needing emergency repairs, forcing them to spend the night at the terminal and catch this first opportunity to get to Greensboro. I introduced myself saying that while Joseph and I had already met on several occasions and even debated, that it was nice to finally meet a nemesis of the late, great Dr. John Henrik Clarke, about whom I had written my master's thesis while at the Africana Studies and Research Center at Cornell University under the then founding director, the late, great Dr. James Turner. Gates perked up, looked at me sternly, looked at Peniel, and rolled his eyes before looking back toward the window. I just smiled. I like letting people know where I stand immediately so we don't have to waste time only to have our terminal differences reveal themselves later. Peniel jumped in. Now, wait a minute, Jared, he said, or something like that. Remember, I'm making this up almost as I go along, so I may not remember accurately what never happened. No, Peniel, you wait a minute. Gates sat up angrily, admonishing his sidekick to let him handle it. Gates glared at me. What I did in the 1990s was rescue a field Clarke and others were sure to ruin, he said. I know you think that, I said, and that's why the New York Times was already crowning you the new star of Black studies in 1990. They saw you then doing the work that the Times loves to see, the destruction of Black radicalism in image. The same paper that was condemning Malcolm, Martin, Clark, and the very idea of Black studies was now calling you the new star. Imagine that. We were only interrupted by the flight attendant stepping center aisle to begin the pre-flight instructions about seatbelts and emergency exits. But Gates kept going. He was furious, but now trying to whisper, "Who even are you? What have you published? I don't even know your name. Jared what? Bell?" No, I laughed. People do that all the time. Not Bell, Ball. And you're right. I've published relative to the both of you very little. But how many mixtapes have either of you made? You may host Nas and Ninth Wonder at Harvard, but you don't know their work either. But be cool, Henry, I said. The last time you got this heated in public, you got perp walked and had to have a beer with Genocide Joe. Jared, said Peniel, I'm so tired of you. If you don't like our approach to the work, why don't you just produce more yourself? All people like you do is talk trash and complain while people like Dr. Gates and I produce the scholarship. Again, you're both right. I said that I have personally not produced scholarship at either of your levels. However, you are both being disingenuous in suggesting that this is the issue. From your beginnings, Henry, you took the most prominent of white mainstream outlets to condemn the work being produced by other African world scholars to isolate yourself and those you want to support with your intellectual entrepreneurialism. That is your desire to sell a version of Black history to the highest white funder. You need funding to produce work, Gates said, a bit loudly. Peniel agreed, saying, without funding, there are no Black studies. Even your vaunted Africana Center had Ford Foundation support. But what they were doing at the Africana Center, I said, with those resources was so different that I heard that while you were there, Henry, you would only claim association with the center, but would never actually come over there. In fact, even in the name, Henry, I said, you've titled your space one of African American studies, which is a limiting rebranding of Africana or even Black studies, which has always had a decidedly pan-African and internationalist approach. How odd, given you've also called it the Du Bois Institute for African American Research. This is a total and complete contradiction, I said. Du Bois was a Pan-African socialist who died in Kwame Nkrumah's Ghana, and yet you reduced the scope of his perspective via such a limiting and anti-Black studies tradition title, symbolically, if not more so, to the study of African America only. Gates interrupted. I and we have produced far more information about the Black world than anyone or any institution you've named. Even beginning with Wonders of the African World, I've shown more of the diaspora to more of the diaspora than anyone could name, and certainly yourself. You're right, Henry, I said. And I was in the Africana Center when that documentary came out and was on hand to hear the late Dr. Ali Mazrui say to me directly how he wished he had not blurbed for it before seeing it. It was condemnable in its erasure of African culture and rebellion, in its tacit praise for the Western Eurocentric lens. But what have you done? Yelled Gates. This time he was even louder, less able to control his anger. Peniel joined. Even I have been behind Netflix and now Disney and National Geographic series about Malcolm and Martin, on top of all the books, articles, and literary series I've been supporting. Indeed, I said, but this has always been my point about you in particular, Peniel. But you too, Henry. The Times calling you, Henry, the new Black studies star was akin to them anointing Jesse Jackson, the new civil rights leader, days after Dr. King was assassinated. You, Henry, showing up in the 90s and the intellectual blood of your targets all over you being chosen by the paper of record is no different than Jackson soaking himself in the blood of King only to reappear as the newly anointed leader and by the same white stream media outlet and paper of record. Worse still, Peniel, when you get praise from none other than Gerald Horne as our premier interpreter of Black power, or Robin D.G. Kelly, who says that Joseph brings Touré's radical ideas into clear focus, it is the leading Black scholars of today praising you despite scholarship being so flawed and empty of the politics and ideas of Kwame Touré and those with which Black power worked. Peniel, in your work, you essentially condemn the Black radical tradition, condemn traditions of pan-Africanism, socialism, armed struggle, anti-colonial imperial politics, the very ideas that moved Touré, Malcolm, Martin, and so many others. And you've done it to become the standard bearer in this generation of those histories and narratives. Yours is not the position of authority on these issues, Gates said to me. Peniel nodded. I agree, I said. But I'm not the one being touted as the star or father of Black studies. And like Bob Brown asked of you, Peniel, since you were writing of his comrade Kwame Ture, if you are the so-called father of Black power studies, who is the mother? Perhaps the mother or mothers, Peniel, are the affluent white women who comprise much of the audience for your work, or the publication of award-winning histories of Malcolm X and the like, despite claiming, as did Wendy Wolf of Viking Press, that she was terrified of the real living Malcolm. Who better than to preside over this history? Similarly, Henry, I asked, was the reward of your 2009 beer summit with Genocide Joe, in which you apologized to the police who abused you, the $30 million you would get in 2013 for your Du Bois Institute? How dare you, Gates yelled. But I said, you took $30 million from Silver Lake Investment Group to start an African-American research institute named after the pan-Africanist socialist Du Bois, and then gave the inaugural Du Bois Award, what Harvard calls its highest honor in the field of African and African-American studies, to people like Valerie Jarrett, the neo-colonial Obama administrator, and then David Stern, the former NBA commissioner whose capitalist enterprises exploited endless amounts of Black labor while protecting the mostly racist and white owners and coaches of a league that is still 70% plus Black. I also granted that same award that year to the late John Lewis, Gates said. Even Peniel had to lower his head on this one. He knew that was a bad look. Exactly, I said. John Lewis, whose good trouble was welcomed by Bill Clinton, who publicly said during his eulogy of Lewis that the white establishment preferred Lewis to Kwame Ture, who Clinton, of course, referred to as Stokely Carmichael. It was weird, because at that moment, Gates and Joseph yelled at me that Lewis was more important than Carmichael. Gates was incensed. He could barely contain himself. Others on the plane began looking, whispering, seemingly concerned. Peniel, I said, I know you wrote that horrible book called Stokely that claims to be about Ture but does not even mention, much less explore, the man's autobiography. That alone should disqualify that book as scholarship or you as a scholar of this history. But even you should know better than to claim that Lewis was somehow more important. Gates jumped back in, saying loudly that all Stokely did was talk trash and lose relevancy by the end of the 1960s, as Joseph points out in his great book. It has been the middle class and the histories I talk about who turned the tide and made real change, he said. I know you feel that way, I said. I saw you years ago in conversation with Peniel, getting so upset at the idea that people the world over love and revere Ture to this day. And then years later, you, I said, Peniel, come back with your truly horrible book called Stokely. Again, Jared, Peniel upset now, write a better one. I can't, I said. I don't write as well as you do. I don't have the time and discipline and resources you had to write a better book. But that isn't really the point, and you know it. Gates huffed and puffed. Peniel scowled. But I said, you both know full well that the issue isn't the absence of work or better work. It is that you both have been positioned to be the spokespeople of Black history regardless of all the great work others produce, and in fact to negate that work. Ture produced his own autobiography, and you, Peniel, calling yourself the father of Black power studies, erased any reference to his own final account and statement of his own beliefs. This is not the result of Ture being incapable of writing a better book about his life. It's about how you, following the tradition largely established by Gates, are positioned to negate the very histories you purport to write about. But it is also my point, Peniel, as I've demonstrated in our previous debate, in my review of your truly terrible book on Ture, you and Henry are positioned and supported to be the Black leaders of white supremacist negations of Black studies and more broadly the Black radical tradition. Black studies was always meant to be the intellectual arm of the Black liberation movement, but neither of you agree with that movement and yet have positioned yourselves to be leading voices of those histories. Why? Henry, why not stay in literary criticism? Peniel, why not write about Black historical figures with which you actually agree instead of claiming to be the father of a wing of study whose politics you hate? Neither man said another word, and none would have been sufficient. Both knew it, so both men, endlessly capable of producing strong statements, chose silence. It was clear that Gates and Joseph were saved by the bell of the pilot alerting the attendants to prepare for landing. Unfortunately, the flight from Baltimore to Greensboro was short, and before I knew it, both men were gone, disappeared into a vehicle I cannot even afford to look at. A friend of mine would later say to me something I promised I would steal from him. When I told him of this fictitious flight, he said that the counterintelligence program, or COINTELPRO, designed by the FBI to destroy all radical movements, had now evolved into PHILINTELPRO, the use of philanthropy and funding to manage and direct potentially threatening movements and wings of thought. Gates had made a name for himself among the white funders of elite black education in the early 1990s, writing screeds in the mainstream press and elsewhere about the horrible Afrocentrists and radical lunatic left. He paved the way for himself as a literary critic and English professor to become the leading voice for the study of blackness in the U.S. and abroad, all the while attacking the very foundation of black studies as, again, the intellectual wing of the Black liberation movement. To summarize my overall point this evening, and that which I would have wanted to make plain on the flight that never happened, the history of black studies here in the U.S. is one of a field that emerged as the unsanctioned intellectual wing of a militant tradition of black political struggle for liberation, and has since become part of the sanctioned effort by the state to suppress even remembering the black liberation struggle at all. My fictitious story of my flight here is all based on actual experiences, statements, and is demonstrated in the work of all involved. But as that flight ended, so has my story, and I thank you for inviting and then listening to it. Thank you very much. And to all our patrons and supporters here at BPM, thank you very much. And to those who will see this later, thank you as well. Please considering liking, sharing, subscribing, and supporting our platform in any way you see fit. And we'll catch you next time here at I Mix What I Like and throughout the platform. Peace, everybody. Only, as Fred Hampton used to say, if you're willing to fight for it, take good care.